6:49 the time now. So we're taking a look this week at how British business is preparing for the biggest change to our economy. For 45 years, we're talking about issues around Brexit, of course.
Of course. Now, so far, we've been to a food market in Manchester, a robotics factory in Blyth, and it's Burns night today. So Ben gets to go to a whisky distillery in the Borders. Lucky, lucky man. Enjoying yourself there, aren't you?
Maybe. There were worse jobs I could have been sent on. And I have to tell you, it smells absolutely incredible. I promised half an hour ago to let you see this. Take a look at this. This is 12,000 litres of yeast, water and sugar. This is one of the first stages of making the whisky here. It's pretty violent, so I'm going to shut that. But yeah, I really wish you could smell it. Those 12,000 litres, well, they turn into about 3,000 of these things. But whilst it might be typically Scottish, it doesn't come much more Scottish, does it, than whisky. It's really interesting where all the component parts, all the inputs for this industry come from elsewhere, particularly the EU. And therefore, with all the concern about Brexit, big questions over where those supplies will come from. Well, let me introduce you to David, who's the boss here. David, morning.
Good morning.
I said there, look, it doesn't get more Scottish than whisky, does it? But you rely on a lot of imports from elsewhere. Give me a sense of where all the bits that you need for this place come from.
Well, OK, the main components of making whisky are water, which we get from here, obviously, yeast, some of it which comes from here, some of it's from France, and barley, which is largely Scottish. But of course, then we've got to think about packaging it and maturing it. So in terms of maturation, we use two types of barrels. We use barrels that have been brought in from the Kentucky in the United States, bourbon barrels, and we use also sherry butts and some wine barrels as well that are largely brought in from Spain. So clearly there's an issue there. And then glass for bottles. We source our bottles currently from France, and we have a very specialist supplier there because we have very special bottles. Don't know what's going to happen there. Corks and bungs and capsules and so forth, all from the European Union.
So it's a real network of supplies, isn't it? Are you worried about how you'll get hold of that stuff?
It's a concern. We're a relatively small producer yet because we're only just back in production after a gap of nearly 100 years. We had to buy in a lot of stock to get the price to the right price for the bottles and the capsules and so forth. So we have a reasonable reserve, but it's not vast. And if it isn't sorted out reasonably quickly, then we will have issues, particularly with glass.
Yeah, good luck. We'll talk more a little later. David, for now, thanks very much. Well, let me introduce you to Karen, who's the boss of the Scotch Whisky Association. Karen, good morning.
Morning.
Look, we're hearing there from David about the challenges that he's got in terms of getting things here, so all the component parts. But the other side of that, of course, is the exports, selling overseas. What's the industry worried about?
Well, the industry's been exporting for 150 years, and in that time we've seen lots of rules change one way or the other. So we can be flexible, we can adapt and change the way we do things. We just need clarity as to how we have to change and then time to implement changes. I would say there are sort of 2 or 3 things that we are particularly concerned about if we end up in a no-deal scenario. One of those is around labelling, how we label our goods going into Europe if we're not a member of the European Union, and another of those is about tariffs, what tariffs might apply in other countries around the world if we drop out of the EU.
And let's talk about that labelling issue, because it sounds like it should be pretty simple, just changing a label on a bottle, but it doesn't quite work like that, does it?
Well, we export 39 bottles of whisky a second leave the UK shores, so it's a lot of whisky on the move. 30% of our exports go into Europe, and generally when we have things like labelling changes, ideally we'd like a year's lead-in. And the issue with leaving the European Union, perhaps without a deal, at the end of March, is potentially we have to change our labels at that point, because every bottle of whisky going into Europe needs the address. It needs a European address on it, and that's about traceability, so that any consumer or company could contact the producer. And at the moment, the EU address that we have on the labels is, of course, the address here in Scotland. So if we had to change the labels, it would be complicated and quite difficult at very short notice.
Yeah, really practical issues to contend with. Karen, for now, thanks so much. Really nice to see you. So there you have it. That's a sense of some of the things that they're concerned with, some of the things that they're having to contend with here. A lot of it, as always, is about getting some sort of certainty so they can start making those plans now. But as you heard there from both guests, it really is about getting a sense of what needs to change, and they can get on with doing it. But of course, still lots of questions over that, what that will mean for their business. More from me after 7. I'll see you then.
OK, enjoy yourself, Ben.